Welcome to Reverend Mike. Come in, come in. Just make yourself comfortable anywhere. We're just hanging out here in the pastor's study. It can be very tiring and demanding, living life from an existentialist point of view. It doesn't leave a whole lot of room for ignoring the world as it is. We're in the universe and of the universe, and wow, that can be exhausting. So one of the things I like to do for downtime is just come back here. It's cozy, got lots of books, lots of newspaper clippings, all kinds of things, and an internet connection. And to unwind a little bit, something I used to do, going back to when I was a kid, my friends and I, we would sometimes take a subject, could be anything, and we would follow it as far as we could, all the cross-references, before any of us knew what hypertext was. And sometimes that just seems fitting, trying to learn more about the universe, even if it sometimes exhausts us. So please make yourself at home. Got coffee, tea, milk, all the usual things, whatever you like. Lots of subjects interest me, and my parents were the lifelong learner types. It sort of rubbed off on me. When I was a little kid, I'd spend a lot of time with the encyclopedias in the public library. And since the internet came along, well, Wikipedia is a fun place to go. Internet searches can be revealing of the mysteries of the universe. And I think it fits right in with existentialist ministry. So I might read a little bit, think a little bit, maybe pontificate on the wonders of the universe and all that. Mostly I just try to relax. Come to think of it, I used to have a friend I'd meet once a week in a coffee shop, and we'd solve all the problems of the universe. Coffee shops have always been good for that. Anyway, I've been thinking about railroads lately, and my mind was wandering earlier this week, and it landed on the subject of timetable and train order operation. It's very old school, and I like things like that. It's a complex system. Railroad timetable and train order operation, very complex system that worked before the modern age and relied on what we might think of as old technology. It's complexity before computers. And there's a meme that's making the rounds, it started making the rounds with self-driving cars, the trolley problem. It's a thought experiment, really an ethical experiment. And there are a lot of permutations, but one basic trolley problem is, say there's a runaway trolley in a city somewhere. It's on a set of tracks, and it is careening toward a large group of people. I think the number is usually 5 people, but typically more than one. And those people have no means of escape. Maybe they're tied to the track for some reason. They cannot get out of the way. And the trolley is well on its way to hitting them, and it will kill them if it hits them. You're watching this unfold, the trolley careening toward a group of people, and it means certain death for them. Suppose you're watching that. But you're standing next to a lever, and that lever is a railroad switch. And a switch on a railroad moves the tracks. The trolley is on one pair of rails, but at that switch, the trolley can keep going on that set, or if you move that switch, you're going to pull the rails, the points of that switch, so that the trolley moves onto a side track. That's how trains are moved around. And you're standing right next to that. So you have the power to change the direction of that trolley. But on that side track, say there's one person on that side track, and you've observed that if the trolley keeps going, it'll hit and kill 5 people. But if you take action, if you move that lever, if you move that railroad switch, then it will move on to the sidetrack and kill one person because that person can't escape either. And that's how the thought experiment goes. It does not leave room for the people somehow getting away. It doesn't leave room for you having enough time and a giant pair of scissors to cut the bonds that's holding them to the tracks. You're standing there, you observe everything, and your decision is, do you let the trolley continue or do you move that lever? Do you kill 5 people through inaction, or do you kill one person through action is one way of looking at it. And you can try to get away from it. You can try to pretend that you don't really have any agency in this. But that's not really how the thought experiment goes. It's forcing you to make a decision to act or to not act. It's a diabolical experiment. There's a website that has many permutations of this, and you can take the quiz. It'll set up a scenario for you, and then once you give an answer, it will say, oh, 63% of other people agree with you and 39% disagree, or it might be vice versa. And there are so many permutations to it. What if it's not 5 random people facing certain death if you let the trolley continue on this way? What if it's 5 criminals and the person on the sidetrack is your grandmother? What if it's 5 relatives and the person on the sidetrack is a criminal? What if the 5 people facing certain death are children and the person on the sidetrack is someone pushing 90? There's so many different variations of this, and you're also not supposed to say, well, the lever, the railroad switch, that's trolley company property, and you really don't have proper training to operate it, and what are you doing standing in such a sensitive area anyway? You're trespassing. You shouldn't. It doesn't let you get away with that. You're supposed to decide. And it all comes down to you. Do you take action, or do you take inaction? Do you regard it as taking inaction to do nothing, to just watch the trolley on its way to where it's headed for some other reason? Being an existentialist can be exhausting. But the real problem about railroads back in the 1800s, they had a different sort of problem, and it did involve switches and sidings and things like that. They still have it today, but now there are modern computers and satellite imagery, radios, all sorts of tools that weren't available in the 1800s. And say you have a model railroad, maybe you had a model railroad, and you might have 1 track and 1 locomotive and a few cars. I had one. It was a Christmas gift. My father was a woodworker, and he made a big plywood layout, and he painted a town and scenery right onto the layout. And then he laid down O-gauge track as that 3-rail track where there are the 2 rails for the wheels to go. And then the 3rd rail was electrified, and that's how the locomotive got its power. And I would play with that for, I don't know how long for each session, but I enjoyed it, especially the younger I was. The older I got, I would keep playing with it, but I would take out the train less and less because it was 1 track. It was a big oval on the board, and the board it fit under my bed. I remember he put wheels on it so I could roll it underneath my bed when I wasn't playing with it, and then just roll it out and hook it up. There's a big transformer. I think it was a blue transformer, and it would hum when I plugged it in. He was a woodworker on the side. He had relatives who taught him how to do that, but by profession, he knew a thing or two about electricity, so I'm sure it was safe. But I can remember the hum of that blue transformer and the wires leading to different places and the plug to go into the wall. But the train would run around 1 oval, and I could reverse it but that was it. There were no sightings or anything like that. And back in the 1800s, when railroads were becoming real and actualized, and transcontinental railroad was being constructed, this was actually before that, the problem that railroad companies had was, how many tracks do you need? Presumably, if they're operating over hundreds of miles, they want to operate multiple locomotives. They might have one at a station on the East Coast, and they might have another station hundreds of miles away to the west. How do you manage all that? Do you need one track per locomotive you have? What if the trains are starting at the extremes? Say they're the main line of the railroad, say that goes east to west, and you can start a locomotive at the east, you can start one at the west. Even if they are hurtling toward each other on the track, they're not going to meet until right about in the middle. So do you need a separate track for them? What if you're operating 50 locomotives over your railroad? What if your railroad goes 300 miles from east to west? How many tracks do you need? And there weren't very many means of communication at that, but the telegraph was introduced, so that became a tool. But the solution the railroads came up with, one solution could have been, well, you just build a whole lot of tracks and hope for the best and put the trains on them. Maybe you do build one track per locomotive, and then each locomotive hauls a bunch of cars, and that makes up a train. It's really costly to build tracks, though, so they were needing a system that was a bit less expensive to that. The system that people came up with, it started out with a few variables. One of them was, okay, you have different locomotives, and those are parts of trains, and the trains move in different directions, different speeds, they have different purposes. We can start to classify those trains, and you can make rules, say a train heading east or a train heading west. One of those is superior to a train heading in the opposite direction. And you could take, for example, trains that are headed east are superior to trains headed west. You could do it vice versa. And then you could say that some trains are express trains. They're not going to make stops along the way. They need to get to their destinations quickly, and those are superior to other trains, say freight trains, local trains that are peddling cars along spurs leading to industries. They're dropping off goods, they're picking up goods, and there might be first class trains, second class trains. You could make any number of these kinds of trains, and then you can start taking those two ideas and you can classify further, and you can say, well, what if you have two express trains, one's traveling east, one's traveling west? You could say, well, one of those is superior to the other. If you say all eastbound trains of the same class are superior to westbound trains of the same class, then if you have an express train headed east and one headed west, you could say the eastbound one is superior, or vice versa, or north-south. You could have all of these rules, and that gives you something to work with, a little bit more to work with than a locomotive is a locomotive. You could do it, I suppose, by eight-wheel locomotives are superior to four-wheel locomotives. I don't know that those existed. You could do it by that, but if you base it on where the train's going, what it's carrying, if you just call it something and say, this is express train number such and such is headed east, then you have a way of distinguishing among some of these trains. And they would take that idea and combine it with a rule that said, for example, if you have two opposing trains, the inferior one has to wait an hour at a station or a siding until that opposing train, the superior train, is in sight and passes. So you could be waiting on a siding, and you're waiting for the train that is your superior to pass. And if an hour passes and you still haven't seen it, well, then you can move ahead, as long as you do so cautiously, slowly. And then once you see that opposing train, assuming it's not held up at the station, well, one of you is going to have to back up. And it's all based on rules and definitions and shared understandings of things, classifying the world, classifying your locomotives and classifying by direction. And then you have a rule that says what different classifications are supposed to do under certain circumstances. And it kept the railroads from having to lay in an overly expensive number of tracks, which they probably wouldn't have space for anyway. But then, right about 1851, and I was looking into this, and the date seems a bit uncertain. There's a railroad executive named Charles Minot, or Minot, possibly? Charles Minot, and he got impatient. Charles Minot, born 1830, born August 30th, 1810. And in 1851, he was general superintendent of the Erie Railroad. And he was waiting. He was waiting on a westbound train, except the train wasn't westbound. It was pointed west, but it was stopped at Turner, New York, waiting as per schedule for an eastbound train from Goshen, New York. Those two stations were about 14 miles apart, and it was waiting according to that time interval schedule, waiting for that opposing train to appear and pass, and then the superintendent's train was going to be allowed to head on to Goshen, New York. He was waiting, and he's waiting, and finally Charles Minot telegraphed the Goshen station to see if that train had left, and he was told no. So he wrote an order, and he's doing this through telegraph. He wrote an order, and he said, to agent and operator at Goshen, hold the train for further orders. So that's the first thing he did. And then, with the train presumably safely held, assuming people would do what they were told, he gave his own train conductors an order that was to be handed to the engineer, and it said, run to Goshen, regardless of opposing trains. And the engineer refused. It went against the timetable. It went against the rules of the railroad, even though Minot was the superintendent. And eventually, Minot took over and he ran the train himself. And so the story goes, that was the first instance of an order being issued to supersede a time interval system, to supersede standing rules. And on the spot, it gave immense flexibility as this overlay to just a standard system that everybody followed. And the Erie Railroad soon began implementing train orders. They were overlays onto the timetables, and a railroad started with a timetable that was a set of agreements, and then train orders were issued that superseded bits and pieces of the timetable. They were little adjustments, except as they grew, they became very big adjustments where it was just routine to have a dispatcher to order trains about on top of the published timetable. And it's kind of like the boss at work saying, okay, I know you're supposed to be working on X, but set that aside for now and work on Y. Oh, but my schedule says I'm supposed to work on X. Right. I'm superseding the schedule. Work on Y. There's a Minot, North Dakota, named after a different Minot, Henry Davis Minot, who was also a railroad executive. He died in a train crash. I don't think they were related. But it occurs to me, all this depends on people having a shared understanding of things, agreements. It applies elsewhere in life. Agreements, definitions, even agreements that people who are employees of a railroad who are given orders are going to follow those orders. It's complexity. Air traffic control is another example of that. Rules, procedures, runway headings, even airport codes are all agreed on in advance, and airlines will publish schedules, and general aviation may file flight plans so that there is a base of what people are going to do. There's a base of understanding of what things mean, right down to runway headings. A runway heading of 02 is more or less 0 degrees, and everyone agrees where 0 degrees is pointing north. And 020, you go around to the right, like it's a clock, so it's a little to the right, or a little to the east of north, if you look at that clock. Yeah, but then there's also an agreement that 020 say it's not exactly 20 degrees necessarily. It might be a little bit more or a little bit less. And also brevity. As the story goes, the first train orders said run to Goshen, regardless of opposing trains. But later on, that would become much more abbreviated. In the 1940s, for example, it might be C&E engine 2203, and engine even is abbreviated to ENG. C&E engine 2203 at St. Louis. Engine 2203 run extra St. Louis to Jefferson City. And that means something. It means conductor and engineer of 2203 sitting at St. Louis, run an extra train from St. Louis to Jefferson City. An air traffic control example might be American XX, whatever the flight number is, line up and wait, runway 22. And that might be rarely issued, but it would tell the pilots on board that flight to line up on the runway and wait, don't take off, and be on runway 22. And runway 22 would be about 220 degrees that direction. The train orders, they used to come in two forms. Form 19 was handed right to the train crew, and crews didn't even have to stop at a station to get it. They could pick it up with one of those hoops that they use to pick up mail bags on the go. The Form 31, though, it had to be signed for, which couldn't be done on the fly. The train had to stop, and the crew had to get out, I suppose, maybe grab coffee while they were at it. That example, it's from a great website article I read years ago, and it's still up on that website. It's from 1999 and adapted from a clinic about timetable and train order operations written by Robert Amsler Jr. Article's still up on the Gateway NMRA website after all these years. Gateway, it's a Missouri chapter of the National Model Railroad Association. I'll read one of my favorite passages here. And the author starts out with a lot of definitions of how timetable and train order operation works, but he does a wonderful thing in this article. He paints a scenario, and he says it's the 1940s during World War II in Missouri, and to pull it all together, he's got this section saying, basically, okay, let's see how everything works in practice. And this is one of my favorite passages. He starts out saying, imagine you're sound asleep on a cold December 1944 night in St. Louis, Missouri. You're awakened by a telephone call. You hear the crew caller announce that you are called for a 6 a.m. train. You sleepily acknowledge the call and begin to gather your grip and make a lunch. You're off to work again. When you arrive at the crew area in St. Louis, you meet your fireman, conductor, head-end brakeman, and rear-end brakeman. At this time, you discuss the news and other items. You have some time to kill before you actually need a report. Before the conductor goes to get the orders, you decide to look at the timetable to see what is running. Mr. Amsler really sets the scene with these paragraphs. They come after a lengthy explanation of how timetable and train order operation works, and then after the scene setter, he gives examples of how timetable and train order operation would be used in that scenario he's just described. A bunch of different examples. So if you're interested, it's a great read. A lot of professions have shorthand, lingo, airlines, railroads. I used to work in a place where a guy would call after he'd received all of the pages I was sending to a press, and he'd say, "You're good to go," which usually meant I was literally free to go at the end of the shift because I'd finished my work, and I was just waiting for confirmation from him that everything I'd sent was received. And when he said, "Good to go," that was the signal. Could shut down the computer, walk out the door. First airport to introduce air traffic control, that was Croydon Airport. There's a historical marker there. It goes back to the 1920s. There's a monument to Charles Minot in Orange County, New York. It's a stone monument erected at the request of E.P. Griffith. He was the superintendent of telegraphs for the Erie Railroad. He introduced some resolutions at a couple of major national conventions to recognize what Minot had done. Association of Railway Telegraph Superintendents Convention, Los Angeles, and the Old Time Telegraphers and Historical Associations Convention in Chicago. And he wanted to recognize, and I'm reading from a website here, quote, "a great epoch in railroad and telegraph history." So he suggested a monument be set up at the site of the original Erie Railroad station at Turner, New York. Raised funds for it and set up a monument. Let's see if I can find the date here. Dedication ceremony took place May 2nd, 1912. There were 2 special trains with about 400 guests, and they came up from the Erie station in Jersey City, in New Jersey. They had Erie Railroad and Western Union private cars, first-class coach, combination coach, over 100 school children. I'll put a link to this. That's interesting. There's a bronze tablet and the monument went through a bunch of changes. Looks like Conrail removed the bronze tablet for some reason, and they were told, local people were told it was protected from vandalism, but then it was returned, and then it was missing again in the early 1990s. Maybe it was stolen, maybe it was being stored somewhere. So there was it also picked up graffiti, it looks like, just glancing at the photos here. I've got some train orders here. Real thing. I got these at a Model Railroad show some years ago. I was always curious about them. And see if I can get they're under plastic right now for safekeeping. But let me get one out. We can take a look at it. Listen to it. It's got a nice cardboard backing to that one. So here we go. Wow. This is they used to call these tissues. I understand why. This reminds me of forms that used to be in triplicate, duplicate. Oh, it says at the bottom here, note, to be used with double carbon paper in a typewriter or stiff tin. Tin, a stiff tin. I don't know what that means. But it's a form 19, and it's on kind of a light blue-green sort of paper. And it really is a form where all of the things on these websites appear here, as a part of it is printed and then part of it is handwritten like a proper form. It's not quite an 8.5 by 11. It's quite a bit smaller than that. It seems pretty efficient for size. Oh, you can measure it here. Let's see. So width is 6.5 inches. Length is 8 inches. So there we go. Not quite an 8.5 by 11. And it says 419, Central Railroad Company of New Jersey, train order number 315 and 315, that's handwritten, October 18, 1973, to C&E number 5309, engine CNJ, so I'm guessing that's Company of New Jersey, 3675 at bank, to C&E number 5309, engine CNJ 3675, and OPR, and operator, I think, at bank. And then the order itself says number 5309, engine CNJ 3675, has right over opposing trains on number 1 track, Long Branch to Neptune, number 5309, engine CNJ 3675 may go. And then it's signed DNN. And then the form picks back up. That's all handwritten. And it says each employee address must have a copy of this order. Made, and that's written in as, I think it says Hawk. Time, 15:35. Okay, so that's military or railroad time. So it's 3:35 p.m. M, Hawk again, operator, and then printed note to be used with double carbon paper and a typewriter or stiff tin. And then there's some numbers printed. I wonder if this is like a serial number. It says 17019 on the left, and then at the bottom right, it's 1-69-200T. I got a couple others like this, same railroad, and those numbers are identical. So maybe it's not a serial number. But that's one. Wow, it really is like a tissue. And then there's another, train order number 308, October 17, 1973. C&E, can't quite read that, Ader, CNT 1542, TOPR, at bank, and, Edna, CNJ 1542, west, has right over opposing trains on number 1 track, bank to Beachport. I think it's Beachport. Stop and proceed at low home original occupant interlocking. I don't think I'm reading that right. Home signal occupant interlocking. This order is something at 12:05 hours. This order is annulled at 12:05 hours. Edna CNJ 1542, West may go. Signed DNN. And then it's made COM, time 11:29, M. There's another signature, and it's got the usual writing. Not far from that monument, still in Orange County, over in Montgomery, is the Orange County Airport, airport code KMGL. And the website for the airport says it's nestled in the heart of the Hudson Valley, just south of the beautiful Catskill Mountains, 1 hour north of New York City. It is an airport. It's one of those that's owned by the local government, It's got 2 runways at 5,007 by 100 feet and 3,672 by 100 feet. Fixed base operator, FBO, providing competitive fuel prices and pilot services, enterprise car rental, reservations and pickup, RNAV GPS approach, ILS approach 0422. So that'd be roughly 040, 40 degrees in one direction, and then 220 degrees, the reciprocal, in the other direction for taking off and landing. Self-service avgas, 100 LL, and Jet A available 24 hours a day. Major repair and flight instruction is offered by on-airport businesses. Shout out to the Orange County Airport. Orange County Airport, KMGL or MGL, if you're not bothered with the international designation. And a special shout out to the ILS approach 0422. Going back to trolleys, there's a passage I read in school from a book called Sister Carrie by Theodore Dreiser. I remember I really like the writing style. It's from 1900, and it's a sort of rags to riches and riches to rags sort of story. And the chapter that we really focused on, I think it was for an American literature class, or maybe it was just a survey of American literature. It was chapter XLI, chapter 41, The Strike. And I think I'll read some of it, and then we'll call it done. Thank you for stopping in and visiting. I always enjoy the company, and like I said, this is pastor study here. This is where I go to spend some downtime and just go from topic to topic to topic. If you like that sort of thing, I hope you come back and we can talk some more. Sister Carrie by Theodore Dreiser, chapter 41, The Strike. And I'll read just a little bit of it, get a sense of Dreiser's writing style, and also a sense of trolleys. The barn at which Hurstwood applied was exceedingly short-handed and was being operated practically by 3 men as directors. There were a lot of green hands around, queer, hungry-looking men who looked as if want had driven them to desperate means. They tried to be lively and willing, but there was an air of hangdog diffidence about the place. Hurstwood went back through the barns and out into a large enclosed lot where were a series of tracks and loops. A half-dozen cars were there, manned by instructors, each with a pupil at the lever. More pupils were waiting at one of the rear doors of the barn. In silence, Hurstwood viewed this scene and waited. His companions took his eye for a while, though they did not interest him much more than the cars. They were an uncomfortable-looking gang, however. 1 or 2 were very thin and lean. Several were quite stout. Several others were raw-boned and sallow, as if they had been beaten up by all sorts of rough weather. "Did you see by the paper they're going to call out the militia?" Hurstwood heard one of them remark. "Oh, they'll do that," returned the other. "They always do." "Think we're liable to have much trouble?" said another, whom Hurstwood did not see. "Not very." "That Scotchman that went out on the last car," put in a voice, "told me that they hit him in the ear with a cinder." A small, nervous laugh accompanied this. "One of those fellows on the Fifth Avenue line must have had a hell of a time, according to the papers," drawled another. "They broke his car windows and pulled him off into the street before the police could stop him." "Yes, but there are more police around today," was added by another. Hurstwood hearkened without much mental comment. These talkers seemed scared to him. Their gabbing was feverish, things said to quiet their own minds. He looked out into the yard and waited. 2 of the men got around quite near him, but behind his back. They were rather social, and he listened to what they said. Are you a railroad man? Said one. Me? No, I've always worked in a paper factory. I had a job in Newark until last October, returned the other, with reciprocal feeling. There were some words which passed too low to hear. Then the conversation became strong again. I don't blame these fellers for striking, said one. They've got the right of it all right, but I had to get something to do. Same here, said the other. If I had my job in Newark, I wouldn't be over here taking chances like this. Taking chances like these. It's hell these days, ain't it? Said the man. The poor man ain't nowhere. He could starve, by God, right out on the streets, and there ain't no one would help you. Right you are, said the other. The job I had, I lost because they shut down. They run all summer and lay up a big stock and then shut down. Hirschwood paid some little attention to this. Somehow he felt a little superior to these two, a little better off. To him these were ignorant and commonplace, poor sheep in a driver's hand. Poor devils, he thought, speaking out the thoughts and feelings of a bygone period of success. Next, said one of the instructors. You're next, said a neighbor, touching him. He went out and climbed on the platform. The instructor took it for granted that no preliminaries were needed. You see this handle, he said, reaching up to an electric cutoff which was fastened to the roof. This throws the current off or on. If you want to reverse the car, you turn it over here. If you want to send it forward, you put it over here. If you want to cut the power, you keep it in the middle. Hirschwood smiled at the simple information. Now this handle here regulates your speed. To here, he said, pointing with his finger, gives you about 4 miles an hour. This is 8. When it's full on, you make about 14 miles an hour. Hirschwood watched him calmly. He had seen motormen work before. He knew just about how they did it, and was sure he could do it as well with a little practice. The instructor explained a few more details, and then said, Now we'll back her up. Hirschwood stood placidly by while the car rolled back into the yard. One thing you want to be careful about, and that is to start easy. Give 1 degree time to act before you start another. The one fault of most men is that they always want to throw her wide open. That's bad. It's dangerous, too. Wears out the motor. You don't want to do that. I see, said Hirschwood. He waited and waited while the man talked on. Now you take it, he said finally. The ex-manager laid a hand to the lever and pushed it gently as he thought. It worked much easier than he imagined, however, with the result that the car jerked quickly forward, throwing him back against the door. He straightened up sheepishly while the instructor stopped the car with the brake. You want to be careful about that, was all he said. Hirschwood found, however, that handling a brake and regulating speed were not so instantly mastered as he had imagined. Once or twice he would have plowed through the rear fence if it had not been for the hand and word of his companion. The latter was rather patient with him, but he never smiled. You've got to get the knack of working both arms at once, he said. It takes a little practice. 1 o'clock came while he was still on the car practicing, and he began to feel hungry. The day set in snowing, and he was cold. He grew weary of running to and fro on the short track. They ran the car to the end, and both got off. Hirschwood went into the barn and sought a car step, pulling out his paper-wrapped lunch from his pocket. There was no water, and the bread was dry, but he enjoyed it. There was no ceremony about dining. He swallowed and looked about, contemplating the dull, homely labor of the thing. It was disagreeable, miserably disagreeable, in all its phases, not because it was bitter, but because it was hard. It would be hard to anyone, he thought. After eating, he stood about as before, waiting until his turn came. The intention was to give him an afternoon of practice, but the greater part of the time was spent in waiting about. At last evening came, and with it hunger and debate with himself as to how he should spend the night. It was 5:30. He must soon eat. If he tried to go home, It would take him 2 hours and a half of cold walking and riding. Besides, he had orders to report at 7 the next morning, and going home would necessitate his rising at an unholy and disagreeable hour. He had only something like $1.15 of Carrie's money, with which he had intended to pay the 2 weeks' coal bill before the present idea struck him. They must have some place around here, he thought. Where does that fellow from Newark stay? Finally, he decided to ask. There was a young fellow standing near one of the doors in the cold, waiting a last turn. He was a mere boy in years, 21 about, but with a body lank and long because of privation. A little good living would have made this youth plump and swaggering. How do they arrange this if a man hasn't any money? Inquired Hurstwood discreetly. The fellow turned a keen, watchful eye on the inquirer. You mean eat? He replied. Yes, and sleep. I can't go back to New York tonight. The foreman will fix that if you ask him, I guess. He did me. That's so. Yes, I just told him I didn't have anything. Gee, I couldn't go home. I live way over in Hoboken. Hurstwood only cleared his throat by way of acknowledgement. They got a place upstairs here, I understand. I don't know what sort of thing it is. Pretty tough, I guess. He gave me a meal ticket this noon. I know that wasn't much. Hurstwood smiled grimly, and the boy laughed. It ain't no fun, is it? He inquired, wishing vainly for a cheery reply. Not much, answered Hurstwood. I'd tackle him now, volunteered the youth. He may go away. Hurstwood did so. Isn't there some place I can stay around here tonight? He inquired. If I have to go back to New York, I'm afraid I won't. There's some cots upstairs, interrupted the man. If you want one of them. That'll do, he assented. He meant to ask for a meal ticket, but the seemingly proper moment never came, and he decided to pay himself that night. I'll ask him in the morning. He ate in a cheap restaurant in the vicinity, and, being cold and lonely, went straight off to seek the loft in question. The company was not attempting to run cars after nightfall. It was so advised by the police. The room seemed to have been a lounging place for night workers. There were some 9 cots in the place, 2 or 3 wooden chairs, a soap box, and a small rounded-belly stove in which a fire was blazing. Early as he was, another man was there before him. The latter was sitting beside the stove warming his hands. Hurstwood approached and held out his own toward the fire. He was sick of the bareness and privation of all things connected with this venture, but was steeling himself to hold out. He fancied he could for a while. Cold, isn't it? Said the early guest. Rather. A long silence. Not much of a place to sleep, is it? Said the man. Better than nothing, replied Hurstwood. Another silence. I believe he'll turn in, said the man. Rising, he went to one of the cots and stretched himself, removing only his shoes, and pulling the one blanket and dirty old comforter over him in a sort of bundle. The sight disgusted Hurstwood, but he did not dwell on it, choosing to gaze into the stove and think of something else. Presently he decided to retire and picked a cot, also removing his shoes. While he was doing so, the youth who had advised him to come here entered, and seeing Hurstwood, tried to be genial. Better nothing, he observed, looking around. Hurstwood did not take this to himself. He thought it to be an expression of individual satisfaction, and so did not answer. The youth imagined he was out of sorts, and set to whistling softly. Seeing another man asleep, he quit that and lapsed into silence. Hurstwood made the best of a bad lot by keeping on his clothes and pushing away the dirty covering from his head. But at last he dozed in sheer weariness. The covering became more and more comfortable. Its character was forgotten, and he pulled it around his neck and slept. Well, let's end it right there. Music is Frost Waltz by Kevin MacLeod, incompatible.com. Licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0 license. creativecommons.org/licenses/by/4.0